Kodak did not collapse because photography disappeared. It collapsed because the technology it invented replaced the business that sustained it. For decades, Kodak dominated global photography. Film manufacturing generated extraordinary margins. Chemistry, processing, and distribution created an integrated ecosystem. But digital imaging began emerging inside Kodak's own laboratories. Electronic sensors improved, storage costs declined, software replaced chemical processing. In 2012, Eastman Kodak filed for bankruptcy protection. It was structural dependence on a model digital photography ultimately eliminated. Eastman Kodak was founded in 1888 in Rochester, New York. The company emerged during the early commercialization of photographic technology. Kodak simplified photography for consumers through standardized film products. The company's early slogan emphasized ease of use and accessibility. Kodak introduced cameras that allowed consumers to capture images without technical expertise. Film processing was centralized through Kodak's own laboratories. This integration allowed Kodak to control multiple stages of photographic production. Manufacturing operations expanded to support growing global demand for photographic film. Kodak invested heavily in chemical engineering and materials science. Film technology became the foundation of the company's industrial capability. By the early 20th century, Kodak had established international distribution networks. Retail partnerships allowed Kodak products to reach consumers across multiple continents. Professional photographers relied heavily on Kodak film products. Motion picture studios used Kodak film for cinema production. The company's technological expertise created barriers to entry for competitors. Film manufacturing required precision chemistry and specialized coating processes. Kodak plants operated at industrial scale. Large facilities were built to manufacture photographic film and related chemicals. These facilities required substantial capital investment. The complexity of film production limited the number of viable competitors. Kodak gradually accumulated a dominant market position. By the mid-20th century, Kodak controlled a large share of global photographic film sales. The brand became synonymous with consumer photography. Kodak cameras were widely distributed through retail channels worldwide. The company expanded into photographic paper and processing chemicals. These products reinforced Kodak's ecosystem around film photography. Kodak also invested in research laboratories dedicated to imaging science. Engineers developed improved film emulsions and color technologies. The company refined processes that increased image quality and reliability. Continuous innovation strengthened Kodak's competitive advantage. Film sales became the central economic driver of the company. Cameras were often priced to support film consumption. This strategy encouraged recurring purchases of film products. Retail stores promoted Kodak film as the default photographic medium. Processing services created additional revenue streams. Consumers returned used film to be developed through Kodak-affiliated labs. This cycle reinforced Kodak's vertically integrated business model. High demand for film generated consistent global revenue. The company's scale allowed efficient mass production. Kodak reinvested profits into manufacturing infrastructure. Film technology remained the foundation of Kodak's corporate strategy. Market leadership appeared structurally secure. Competitors struggled to replicate Kodak's production expertise. Consumer behavior reinforced the dominance of film photography. Photography was economically organized around chemical processing. Kodak controlled critical technologies across the imaging supply chain. This control created strong institutional confidence in the film business. The company's governance structures prioritized protecting film revenue. Investment decisions reinforced the stability of the existing system. Structural takeaway: Kodak's dominance was built on an integrated film ecosystem that aligned technology, manufacturing, and distribution around a single economic model. Kodak's dominance in photography was reinforced by the economics of film. Photographic film generated extremely high profit margins. During its peak years, film margins often exceeded 60%. These margins were supported by proprietary chemical formulations. Kodak controlled the intellectual property behind many film technologies. Manufacturing processes required specialized industrial equipment. The complexity of production limited competition. Each roll of film represented a recurring revenue transaction. Consumers repeatedly purchased film for everyday photography. Kodak's business model therefore emphasized volume consumption. Camera hardware was frequently priced to encourage film sales. The strategy resembled a consumables model. Film functioned as the primary profit engine. Kodak also sold photographic paper for printing images. Processing chemicals represented an additional revenue layer. Laboratories used Kodak chemistry to develop photographs. Retail photo processing services generated further income. The system created multiple revenue points across the imaging cycle. Kodak captured value from image capture to final print. This integration strengthened economic stability. Consumer photography depended on physical materials. Film had to be manufactured, distributed, exposed, and processed. Each stage involved Kodak products or services. Retailers stocked Kodak film as a standard inventory item. Professional studios relied on Kodak supplies for consistent output. Motion picture studios used specialized Kodak film stock. Television and media organizations also used Kodak imaging materials. Demand extended across both consumer and professional markets. The company therefore benefited from diversified photographic demand. Kodak's supply chain operated on global scale. Production plants supplied film to international markets. Distribution networks ensured constant product availability. The reliability of film consumption reinforced predictable revenue streams. Corporate planning assumed continued demand for analog photography. Strategic investment favored expanding manufacturing capacity. Capital expenditures supported large-scale film production facilities. These facilities represented long-term industrial commitments. Financial forecasts depended on stable film demand. Corporate incentives were aligned with maintaining film profitability. Senior leadership measured performance through film revenue growth. Product development often focused on improving film technology. The profitability of film discouraged rapid experimentation elsewhere. Alternative imaging technologies were viewed through the lens of film economics. Any innovation that threatened film consumption created financial risk. As a result, the film business became both Kodak's strength and its constraint. Structural takeaway. Extraordinary film margins created incentives that anchored Kodak's strategy to the continued dominance of analog photography. Kodak's dominance also depended on a vast global distribution network. Film products moved through an extensive system of wholesalers and retailers. Retail camera shops served as the primary interface between Kodak and consumers. Large department stores also carried Kodak photography supplies. International distributors expanded Kodak's presence across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Logistics systems ensured film availability in nearly every major consumer market. The supply chain supported a constant flow of photographic materials. Kodak also developed standardized packaging that simplified retail stocking. Brightly colored film boxes became recognizable across global retail environments. Retailers benefited from predictable consumer demand for film products. Processing services represented the second pillar of the distribution system. Consumers typically returned exposed film to retail counters for development. These film rolls were transported to processing laboratories. Kodak-operated laboratories processed enormous volumes of film daily. Chemical development required controlled industrial facilities. Processing centers used Kodak proprietary chemistry and equipment. Retail partners therefore remained integrated with Kodak's processing infrastructure. This arrangement reinforced Kodak's control over the photography ecosystem. Each image captured by consumers entered Kodak's industrial processing network. The company earned revenue not only from film sales, but also from processing services. Large automated laboratories printed photographs onto Kodak photographic paper. Completed photo prints were returned to consumers through retail stores. This processing cycle created recurring interaction between consumers and Kodak products. The system reinforced brand loyalty through consistent photographic results. Professional photographers also depended on Kodak processing services. Commercial studios required reliable color reproduction and print quality. Kodak's laboratories specialized in high-volume photographic development. Large cities hosted major processing facilities capable of handling thousands of rolls per day. Global expansion required careful coordination of shipping and processing logistics. Film transported from retail counters moved through centralized development pipelines. The infrastructure supporting film processing required significant capital investment. Kodak invested heavily in building and maintaining this industrial network. Distribution centers coordinated shipments of film, paper, and chemicals worldwide. Transportation systems connected manufacturing plants with international markets. Inventory planning ensured retailers rarely experienced supply shortages. Corporate management viewed this infrastructure as a strategic advantage. Few competitors could replicate Kodak's scale in distribution and processing. The ecosystem created strong operational interdependence across the industry. Retail stores, laboratories, and manufacturers all depended on Kodak technology. This dependence reinforced Kodak's central position within global photography. Consumers rarely interacted with alternative photographic systems. The network effect strengthened Kodak's dominance for decades. Corporate strategy, therefore, focused on maintaining this integrated structure. Investment decisions prioritized sustaining the film and processing network. The scale of infrastructure increased Kodak's exposure to technological shifts. Any change in photography technology would affect the entire system simultaneously. As digital imaging emerged, this infrastructure became a potential liability. Structural takeaway: Kodak's global distribution and processing infrastructure created scale advantages, but also increased structural dependence on the continuation of film photography. Kodak's research laboratories were among the most advanced imaging research centers in the world. Engineers continuously explored improvements in photographic technology. Research teams worked on optics, chemistry, and electronic imaging systems. In 1975, a Kodak engineer named Steven Sasson developed an experimental digital camera prototype. The device captured images using an electronic image sensor. The prototype used a charge-coupled device sensor to record light electronically. Captured images were stored on magnetic cassette tape. The camera required several seconds to record a single photograph. Image resolution was extremely low compared with film photography. The prototype demonstrated that photography could be captured electronically. The concept eliminated the need for photographic film. Images could be stored as electronic data instead of chemical exposures. Engineers recognized the long-term potential of electronic imaging. Digital images could be displayed on screens instead of printed photographs. Software processing could replace chemical development. This shift implied a fundamental change in the economics of photography. Film manufacturing would become less necessary in a digital system. Chemical processing laboratories would no longer be required. Physical film distribution would gradually lose relevance. The digital prototype was therefore technologically disruptive. However, the technology was still immature in the 1970s. Electronic storage capacity remained limited. Image quality lagged behind traditional film photography. Computing hardware remained expensive and slow. Consumer electronics infrastructure was not yet capable of supporting digital imaging. Despite these limitations, Kodak engineers continued experimenting with electronic imaging systems. Research projects explored digital sensors and image compression techniques. Laboratories developed early prototypes of electronic photography equipment. Internal presentations demonstrated the potential long-term trajectory of digital photography. Engineers predicted that electronic imaging could eventually rival film. However, commercialization remained distant during the early development period. Corporate leadership viewed digital imaging primarily as a research concept. The technology did not yet threaten the film business model. Film photography still delivered superior image quality. Consumer demand for film continued growing during the 1970s and 80s. Kodak therefore prioritized improving film technology. Digital imaging remained a secondary research program. Research divisions continued filing patents related to electronic imaging. Kodak accumulated a large portfolio of digital imaging intellectual property. These patents covered sensors, image processing, and storage technologies. Despite technological leadership, Kodak did not immediately commercialize digital cameras. Corporate planning remained focused on the film ecosystem. Film revenue continued dominating Kodak's financial performance. Digital imaging therefore remained inside the research laboratory. The invention existed within Kodak's technological capability, but outside its core strategy. Structural takeaway: Kodak invented digital imaging technology, but its economic dependence on film delayed the strategic commitment required to commercialize it.
During the 1980s and early 1990s, digital imaging technology continued improving. Sensor resolution gradually increased as semiconductor manufacturing advanced. Electronic storage devices became more reliable and affordable. Computing hardware improved the ability to process digital images. Kodak research laboratories continued experimenting with digital imaging systems. Engineers tested early digital capture devices for professional applications. These early systems were often used in scientific and industrial environments. Kodak also explored partnerships with technology companies developing digital electronics. The company recognized that digital imaging could eventually reach consumer markets. However, digital cameras initially remained expensive and technically limited. Image resolution remained inferior compared with high-quality film photography. Battery technology constrained portability and performance. Consumer adoption therefore progressed slowly during the early stages of development. Despite these limitations, digital imaging began attracting attention across the technology sector. Electronics companies began investing in sensor and imaging technology. Japanese camera manufacturers explored hybrid electronic imaging products. Companies such as Sony and Canon began experimenting with digital camera systems. These developments indicated a broader technological transition within photography. Kodak also introduced early digital imaging products aimed at professional users. Some of these systems were designed for news agencies and media organizations. Digital cameras allowed immediate image transmission through electronic networks. Photojournalists could deliver images more quickly than traditional film development allowed. This capability demonstrated a practical advantage for digital imaging. However, consumer photography still relied heavily on film. Retail processing infrastructure remained dominant during the 1990s. Kodak continued generating significant revenue from film and processing. The company invested in incremental digital imaging initiatives. Corporate leadership monitored technological progress in electronic imaging. Internal strategy discussions considered potential market transitions. However, digital adoption remained uncertain during the early development period. Consumer demand for film still appeared stable. Film products continued generating strong profit margins. Corporate resources therefore remained concentrated in the traditional business model. Digital imaging programs operated alongside the existing film ecosystem. The company attempted to manage both technologies simultaneously. Film manufacturing infrastructure continued expanding during this period. Processing laboratories maintained high operational volumes. Retail networks continued promoting film-based photography. Digital cameras therefore remained a complementary technology rather than a replacement. However, underlying technology trends continued improving electronic imaging performance. Storage costs declined, and sensor performance increased. Consumer electronics companies accelerated digital camera development. These changes gradually increased competitive pressure within the imaging industry. Kodak faced the challenge of balancing film profitability with emerging digital technology. The strategic question became how quickly the company should transition toward digital imaging. Structural takeaway: early digital imaging development demonstrated technological potential, but Kodak's profitable film ecosystem delayed full strategic commitment to the transition.
As digital imaging progressed, Kodak faced increasing strategic tension. The company possessed deep technical knowledge of digital imaging systems. However, the economic structure of Kodak remained tied to film profitability. Senior leadership recognized that digital photography could eventually replace film. Internal strategy discussions examined the potential impact on revenue streams. Film products continued delivering extremely high margins. These margins supported large manufacturing facilities and global distribution networks. Accelerating digital adoption threatened these economic foundations. Transitioning quickly toward digital imaging could cannibalize existing revenue. Corporate governance structures therefore faced conflicting incentives. Research teams continued advancing digital imaging technology. Engineering divisions demonstrated prototypes and technical feasibility. However, commercialization required large-scale strategic investment. Digital cameras would reduce demand for film and processing services. Retail photo development infrastructure could become obsolete. Manufacturing plants dedicated to film production might become underutilized. Corporate leadership therefore evaluated the pace of technological transition. Some executives argued for cautious adoption of digital products. They emphasized protecting the profitability of the film business. Other internal voices advocated stronger investment in digital technology. These debates reflected competing priorities within Kodak's leadership. The company attempted to balance both strategic directions simultaneously. Film operations continued receiving significant capital support. Manufacturing infrastructure required ongoing maintenance and expansion. Large facilities could not be easily repurposed. Thousands of employees worked within film-related divisions. Operational planning assumed continued demand for analog photography. Digital programs therefore advanced gradually rather than aggressively. Kodak released some early digital camera products. Many of these products targeted professional photography markets. Consumer digital adoption remained limited during the early years. However, technology trends continued moving in favor of digital imaging. Electronic sensors improved rapidly in performance and cost efficiency. Electronic consumer companies accelerated digital camera development. Japanese manufacturers expanded their presence in the imaging market. Kodak attempted to compete within the emerging digital segment. However, internal resource allocation remained divided. Film revenue continued funding the majority of corporate operations. Digital products initially generated smaller margins than film. The financial trade-off complicated strategic decision-making. Corporate planning therefore proceeded cautiously. Leadership hoped to manage a gradual transition between technologies. However, technological disruption rarely progresses gradually. As digital cameras improved, the pace of industry change accelerated. Consumer behavior began shifting toward electronic image capture. This transition exposed the structural tension inside Kodak's business model. Structural takeaway: strategic hesitation often emerges when disruptive technology threatens the profit engine sustaining the incumbent organization. During the late 1990s and early 2000s, digital photography began accelerating rapidly. Advances in semiconductor technology improved the performance of digital image sensors. Sensor resolution increased while manufacturing costs declined. Consumer electronics companies invested heavily in digital camera development. Japanese manufacturers expanded global production of digital imaging devices. Companies such as Canon, Sony, and Nikon released new digital camera models. These products gradually reached consumer price levels. Personal computers became common household technology. Consumers could store photographs electronically on computer hard drives. Image editing software allowed digital manipulation of photographs. Email and the Internet created new methods for sharing images. Digital photography therefore changed how photographs were distributed. Printing photographs became optional rather than essential. Traditional film development services began experiencing declining demand. Retail photo processing counters saw fewer film submissions. Digital cameras eliminated the need for chemical processing. Images could be viewed instantly on electronic displays. This convenience accelerated consumer adoption. Younger consumers began preferring digital photography over film. Electronics retailers expanded shelf space for digital cameras. Technology companies emphasized rapid product innovation cycles. Digital camera capabilities improved each year. Memory storage capacity expanded dramatically. Compact flash and other memory cards enabled large photo storage. Battery technology also improved device portability. Digital cameras became easier for consumers to operate. Image quality gradually approached the standards of film photography. Professional photographers began adopting digital equipment. News organizations transitioned to digital cameras for faster reporting. Photojournalists valued the ability to transmit images immediately. Film processing delays became a competitive disadvantage. Kodak attempted to participate in the digital camera market. The company released several consumer digital camera products. However, competition intensified across the industry. Electronics companies possessed strong expertise in digital hardware. Software capabilities became increasingly important in imaging systems. Kodak's traditional strengths centered on chemistry and film materials. The competitive landscape, therefore, began shifting toward electronics and software. Digital imaging revenues grew across the industry. Meanwhile, film consumption began declining steadily. Retail demand for film products weakened year by year. Processing laboratories experienced falling operational volumes. Manufacturing plants faced lower utilization rates. The economic foundation supporting Kodak's historical dominance began eroding. Corporate strategy struggled to keep pace with the technological shift. Structurally, takeaway. Once digital photography reached consumer viability, the economics of the film ecosystem began collapsing across the entire industry.
By the early 2000s, the shift toward digital photography became increasingly visible in market data. Consumer adoption of digital cameras accelerated rapidly across global markets. Electronics retailers expanded shelf space dedicated to digital imaging devices. Personal computers provided convenient platforms for storing digital photographs. Internet connectivity enabled electronic sharing of images through email and websites. These technological developments gradually reduced dependence on film photography. Consumers began taking larger numbers of photographs using digital cameras. However, these images no longer required physical film or chemical processing. The traditional photography value chain began contracting. Retail photo processing counters received fewer film rolls each year. Processing laboratories experienced declining operational volumes. Kodak's manufacturing plants began operating below historical capacity. Inventory levels of photographic film increased within distribution warehouses. Retail partners reduced orders for film products. Declining demand affected multiple segments of Kodak's business model. Film sales had historically supported the company's highest profit margins. As demand weakened, these margins began shrinking. Corporate revenue growth slowed across the early 2000s. Financial analysts observed structural change within the imaging industry. Digital cameras continued improving in resolution and usability. Consumer confidence in digital photography increased steadily. Professional photographers accelerated their transition to digital equipment. News agencies largely abandoned film-based photography workflows. Photojournalism adopted digital cameras as the industry standard. Instant image transmission became operationally essential for media organizations. These changes reinforced the broader shift toward electronic imaging. Kodak attempted to respond through expanded digital product lines. The company introduced consumer digital cameras under the Kodak brand. Some products achieved moderate market success. However, digital camera markets became intensely competitive. Electronics manufacturers possessed strong supply chain advantages. Software development also became central to imaging technology. Kodak's historical expertise centered on chemistry rather than electronics. As a result, profit margins in digital products remained lower than film. Revenue growth from digital products struggled to offset declining film sales. Corporate restructuring efforts attempted to reduce operating costs. Manufacturing plants were gradually closed or consolidated. Employee reductions occurred across film-related divisions. These measures reflected the structural decline of the film market. Financial pressure increased as revenues continued falling. The company explored monetizing its extensive patent portfolio. Intellectual property became an increasingly important corporate asset. However, patents alone could not fully replace the economics of film. The industry transition toward digital imaging continued accelerating. Kodak's legacy infrastructure became progressively less relevant. Structural takeaway: once digital adoption reached scale, the decline of film revenue accelerated across every layer of Kodak's integrated business model.
By the end of the 2000s, Kodak's financial position had weakened significantly. Film sales had declined sharply across global markets. Digital camera products generated revenue but produced lower margins than film. The company faced increasing pressure to restructure its operations. Manufacturing plants built for large-scale film production became underutilized. Processing laboratories handled far fewer film rolls than in previous decades. Retail partners continued reducing film inventory orders. Corporate revenue declined steadily year after year. Operating costs remained high due to legacy infrastructure. Large manufacturing facilities required ongoing maintenance and staffing. These facilities had been designed for peak film demand. As demand collapsed, many assets became economically inefficient. Kodak began implementing cost reduction programs. Plant closures occurred across several manufacturing locations. Workforce reductions affected thousands of employees. Corporate leadership attempted to stabilize financial performance. Digital imaging products remained a central strategic focus. However, competition intensified across the consumer electronics market. Companies specializing in electronics held cost advantages. Lower prices reduced profit margins across the industry. Kodak struggled to achieve sustainable profitability in digital hardware. Meanwhile, film revenue continued shrinking. The company also carried substantial pension obligations. Debt levels increased as financial pressure intensified. Investors became increasingly concerned about Kodak's long-term viability. Credit ratings reflected growing financial risk. Corporate restructuring plans attempted to reduce operating expenses. The company also explored licensing its intellectual property. Kodak possessed an extensive portfolio of imaging patents. These patents covered digital imaging technologies developed over decades. Patent licensing generated additional revenue streams. However, licensing income could not fully offset declining film sales. Cash flow pressures increased across corporate operations. Kodak attempted to sell segments of its patent portfolio. Strategic alternatives were evaluated by corporate leadership. Financial advisors examined restructuring scenarios. Despite these efforts, liquidity challenges continued growing. Credit markets became less willing to extend financing. Operating losses accumulated over multiple fiscal periods. The company faced increasing difficulty meeting financial obligations. Corporate leadership eventually considered bankruptcy protection as an option. In January 2012, Eastman Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing allowed the company to reorganize its operations. It also enabled management to restructure debt and reduce costs. Bankruptcy marked the end of Kodak's long era of photographic dominance. Structural takeaway: when declining legacy revenue cannot be replaced quickly enough by new technology businesses, financial collapse becomes increasingly likely.
Following the Chapter 11 filing, Kodak began restructuring its corporate operations. The bankruptcy process allowed management to reorganize financial obligations. Debt restructuring became a central component of the recovery strategy. The company also focused on monetizing its intellectual property assets. Kodak possessed one of the largest imaging patent portfolios in the industry. Many of these patents related to digital imaging technologies. The company had accumulated these patents through decades of research. Digital imaging patents covered sensors, image processing, and storage technologies. Technology companies expressed interest in licensing these patents. Patent licensing became a potential source of liquidity. Kodak initiated negotiations with multiple technology firms. Financial advisors assisted the company in evaluating patent valuation. Some patents were sold, while others were licensed to industry participants. These transactions generated significant but limited financial relief. The strategy provided temporary capital during the restructuring period. However, intellectual property monetization could not fully replace lost film revenue. Kodak therefore pursued additional operational restructuring. Manufacturing operations were reduced significantly. Several film production facilities were permanently closed. Processing laboratories were also consolidated or eliminated. Corporate workforce reductions continued during the restructuring period. The company shifted strategic focus toward commercial imaging technologies. Business segments targeting enterprise printing and packaging gained attention. Industrial printing technologies became part of Kodak's revised strategy. These segments relied more heavily on digital technology. The restructuring aimed to create a smaller but sustainable company. Management attempted to align the organization with modern imaging markets. Legacy film infrastructure was gradually removed from the balance sheet. Operating costs were reduced through plant closures and workforce reductions. Corporate leadership focused on stabilizing remaining business units. Investors monitored the restructuring process closely. Financial markets evaluated Kodak's long-term viability after bankruptcy. The company also worked to resolve outstanding legal obligations. Restructuring plans required approval from bankruptcy courts. Creditors negotiated terms associated with the reorganization plan. These negotiations determined the distribution of remaining corporate value. Kodak gradually exited several legacy business lines. The company emerged from bankruptcy with a smaller operational footprint. Post-bankruptcy operations focused on specialized imaging technologies. However, the scale of the new company was significantly reduced. Kodak no longer operated as the dominant photography company. The restructuring process concluded with a transformed corporate structure. The historical film empire had effectively disappeared. Kodak survived as a specialized imaging and printing technology firm. Structural takeaway: restructuring after disruption often requires abandoning the legacy system that once defined the company's success. Kodak's collapse represents a structural transformation in the economics of photography. For most of the 20th century, Kodak controlled the global film ecosystem. Manufacturing plants produced photographic film at enormous industrial scale. Distribution networks delivered Kodak products to markets across the world. Processing laboratories developed millions of photographs every day. This vertically integrated system created strong economic stability. However, the foundation of the system depended entirely on chemical film photography. Digital imaging introduced a fundamentally different technological architecture. Images could be captured electronically using semiconductor sensors.
Photographs could be stored as digital data rather than physical negatives. Computers allowed images to be processed without chemical development. Internet networks enabled instant sharing of digital photographs. These changes eliminated multiple steps in the traditional film value chain. Film manufacturing became unnecessary for digital photography. Chemical processing laboratories lost their operational role. Retail photo development counters gradually disappeared. Industrial infrastructure built for film production lost economic relevance. The integrated photography ecosystem that supported Kodak began collapsing. Digital imaging technologies rapidly improved throughout the 2000s. Electronics companies accelerated innovation in sensors and software. Consumer cameras increasingly depended on digital components. Computing platforms replaced traditional photographic processing. Image editing software became central to modern photography. This technological shift changed the competitive structure of the industry. Success in imaging now required expertise in electronics and computing. Kodak's historical strengths centered on chemistry and film engineering. These capabilities became less important in the digital era. Profit margins in digital cameras remained significantly lower than film. Legacy manufacturing infrastructure created heavy fixed costs. Operational systems remained tied to declining film demand. Strategic transition became increasingly difficult for the organization. Technological disruption accelerated faster than corporate adaptation. Declining film revenue weakened Kodak's financial stability. The company attempted restructuring and cost reduction programs. Patent licensing provided temporary financial relief. However, intellectual property income could not replace the film economy. Bankruptcy in 2012 formalized the collapse of Kodak's historical business model. The company emerged from restructuring as a much smaller organization. Modern Kodak focuses on specialized imaging and industrial printing technology. The global film empire that once defined the company disappeared. Kodak's experience illustrates how technological substitution reshapes industries. Dominant companies often depend on systems that innovation eventually replaces. When revenue depends on legacy technology, strategic hesitation becomes likely. Innovation alone does not guarantee successful transformation. Economic incentives ultimately determine corporate decisions. Structural takeaway. Technology disruption becomes structural risk when incumbent revenue depends on the system being replaced.